if there's one concern that I have about Robert Garcia as AJ's new trainer, and it's a fairly major concern to be fair, it's the fact that Garcia doesn't have much experience training heavyweights. And that is important because heavyweight boxing is very different to all other weight divisions. At heavyweight, of course, there's no weight limit. At heavyweight, there's often a huge disparity in terms of height, reach, foot speed, hand speed between two fighters because of these huge size differences. And the power at heavyweight is so much more of a factor than it is certainly at welterweight, lightweight, and these kind of weights where Robert Garcia has a lot of experience training people. Heavyweights can't do the kind of things generally that a welterweight or a lightweight fighter can do. And so if it's a trainer that isn't used to working with heavyweights, sometimes they expect the heavyweight to do things that they're simply not capable of. A heavyweight can't throw that many punches. A heavyweight can't pull off certain moves as well as a much smaller fighter. So a trainer like Garcia who doesn't have much experience with heavyweights, he needs to be cognizant of all these things. And when it comes to formulating a game plan, the game plan needs to factor in the heavyweight dynamic in terms of not being able to throw as many shots, not being as nimble, being more susceptible to getting knocked down, knocked out, seriously buzzed, etc. So that is a concern with regards to Robert Garcia, but just because he hasn't worked with a lot of heavyweights in the past doesn't necessarily mean that he won't be able to do good work with AJ. I mean, if you take Manny Stewart, for example, Manny Stewart really didn't train many heavyweights or, off the top of my head, any heavyweights until he trained Evander Holyfield, to my knowledge. I don't recall him training any other heavyweights up until he trained Holyfield. And by the time he trained Holyfield for the Riddick Bowe rematch, Manny Stewart had a deep resume in terms of world champions and what have you. So he trained Holyfield, and then after, because he only had one fight with Holyfield, after that, he eventually trained Lennox Lewis. The Holyfield Bowe rematch was, I think, 1990, gosh, when was that? 93, 94? So it would have been around the same time, actually. Yeah, it would have been quite shortly after he trained Holyfield. He trained Oliver McCall, of course, for the first Lewis fight. And then he trained Lennox Lewis after he left McCall, because he only had one fight with McCall. And then he trained Lennox Lewis after that. So he started working with heavyweights, to my knowledge, from the second Holyfield Bowe fight. But prior to that, his career had been with welterweights and, people of the lighter weight divisions. And he worked very well with heavyweights, didn't he? His first major heavyweight, Evander Holyfield, and he goes and wins back the heavyweight title with Holyfield. Now, to be fair, Holyfield was a heavyweight, yes, but he'd moved up from light heavyweight. So perhaps, and because he started out his career at light heavyweight, then he'd gone up to cruiserweight, became undisputed cruiserweight champion, then undisputed heavyweight champion. So perhaps that was kind of a good place to start for Manny Stewart, because he wasn't dealing with a big, slow guy. He was dealing with a guy who really was a blown up cruiserweight, light heavyweight in Holyfield. So he could do certain things by way of moves and skill and work rate and what have you. And maybe that made it a bit easier for Manny Stewart to transition into training heavyweights. Oliver McCall, however, not so nimble and fast as Holyfield, but he still trained him successfully to knock out Lennox Lewis. Then he did a great rebuilding job with his first real big heavyweight in Lennox Lewis. Now, Manny Stewart did train many other heavyweights in the 90s, such as Darnell Nicholson. I think his first name was Darnell. He was an Olympian, I believe, but he didn't turn out to be much in the pro ranks. But he did train Darnell Nicholson. Who else did he train? He trained Ola Clemenson at light heavyweight, but Michael Moore. He trained Michael Moore as a light heavyweight. He trained Moore, I think, for his first few heavyweight fights. But Moore then split with him and worked with Teddy Atlas. And Atlas was in Moore's corner when he beat Holyfield for the world title. And Atlas also was in Moore's corner when he got beat by George Foreman. So, yeah. And of course, like I say, Mora was a smaller guy just like Holyfield, who was part of that Kronk setup. Anyway, the point I'm making is just because Robert Garcia hasn't worked with heavyweights in the past doesn't necessarily mean he can't do good work with AJ. As we saw with Manny Stewart, if you're good enough, if you know what you're doing, you will be able to translate the stuff you've taught to other fighters, to heavyweights. Obviously, you're going to have to tweak it a bit and make provisions for the fact that heavyweights are bigger and slower and they have to be more concerned about the power of their opponent and what have you, but it can be done. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below.